Computer. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first reading group of this year, where I'm going to be presenting a survey of electrostatic global placers that are used in analytical placement techniques for both ASICs and FPGAs. Now, I made way too many slides, so I think I'm just going to go through the ASIC section, then we'll review the time. If we have more time, I'll move on to the FPGA section. If I don't have enough time, we'll continue this next week. So first of all, FPGA placement, it has a very complicated problem of I have this complicated circuit that has a bunch of connections between all these different atoms, and I have to place them onto a heterogeneous FPGA that looks like that one. And what I'm showing here is a simulated annealing algorithm, but I want to show you that the input to FPGA placement is an atom netlist of both lookup tables, flip-flops, DSPs, RAMs, etc. The output is a clustered placement, which means I've taken those atoms, put them into clusters, and placed them somewhere on the FPGA in a valid location. Our objective is often minimize wire length and critical path delay, as well as others like routability. And our constraints are atoms can only be placed in compatible cells where a path exists for each of the atom's connections. So I can't place an atom in a DSP block, and I can't place too many atoms in one tile because there's no route to get the connections in and out. So that is my FPGA placement problem. And what I'm showing here is simulated annealing, which is the more common way of, or the way that VPR does it. But I want to show you another technique, which is becoming increasingly more popular for FPGAs, and that's analytical placement techniques. So a common analytical placement flow is made up of three phases: global placement, full legalization, and detailed placement. Global placement is where analytical placement gets its name. What we do is we relax our objective function and we relax our constraints and turn them into an analytical equation that we can solve. And when we solve that equation iteratively, we can get a good atom level placement, in which we call a global placement. Once we have that atom level placement, the issue is because we relax those constraints, it's not fully legalized. So what you have to do is pass it through a full legalizer, which fully legalizes the placements of atoms onto the FPGA fabric. You can think of this as clustering and initial placement if you've done simulated annealing flows like was found in VTR. Once you have placed those, most likely things have been moved slightly. And also you might want to fix things up using non-analytical techniques. And this is where detailed placement comes in, which optimizes a post-legalized solution, which means we move things around while keeping it legal, and we improve the objectives while remaining fully legal. So that's an analytical placement flow. And in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the global placement step, since this is where most of the magic happens. So I'm going to move right into it. But any questions on the analytical placement flow before we get into global placement? Cool. So there are two types of global placers. There's quadratic global placers and there's nonlinear global placers. The quadratic global placers are, we're trying to minimize an unconstrained quadratic objective function, which looks something like this. The Q matrix you see here encodes the connections between movable blocks, and the C matrix encodes the connections between movable blocks and fixed points. And by minimizing this equation, I can try to minimize our wire length, which is encoded into the Q matrix, while also observing our fixed constraints. And we can play with anchor points to make that deal with other constraints. And this can be efficiently solved by taking the derivative of that function and setting it equal to 0. So we can solve, when you take the derivative and set this equal to 0, what this becomes is a system of linear equations, and that can be efficiently solved using things like conjugate gradient, which is and also this Q matrix is extremely sparse, so we can use sparse solvers as well, which can further save runtime. The constraints, so this function only has objectives, and we also want to encode constraints into it. To encode the constraints, we have to do that through edge weighting, where we change the values inside the Q matrix, or we change the anchor points by adding new points that try to draw the atoms away from where they want to be according to the wire length objective. And so to use a quadratic global placer, what you have to do is solve the quadratic equation, partially legalize it, update the weights, update the fixed points, and then solve again iteratively until the points have spread out enough that you can stop. So that's a quadratic global placers. And the second class is called nonlinear global placers. They're called this because we solve quadratic global placers using linear systems of equation solvers. So nonlinear global placers minimize a differential objective function f of x subject to a differentiable constraint function g of x. Now, I'm kind of cheating on notation here, but g of x is just a function where the larger g of x is, the more you've broken your constraints, and the smaller g of x is, the more you haven't broken your constraints. And we can solve this optimization problem using a Lagrangian. What we do is we do Lagrangian relaxation, and we say we want to minimize our objective function f of x plus some penalty factor times the constraint function. So, and this penalty factor will start off very low, and iteratively as I solve, I'm going to increase the penalty factor saying, okay, what if I were to apply more constraints? What if I applied some more constraints and keep going? Eventually we'll spread things out enough so we can stop. So this is often solved using gradient descent techniques. And constraints are encoded in g of x, but they must be relaxed into a differentiable form. Whereas on the left side, I was able to use a more combinatorial optimization type approach where I can spread things out using flow-based techniques. Here, I have to use a differentiable form if I want to use a true nonlinear global placer. And then finally, the Lagrangian is solved iteratively with increasing values of lambda with a higher penalty for breaking the constraints. So that's a quadratic global placers, and that's nonlinear global placers. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of either of them. Now, these are more or less my opinions, but quadratic global placers, they are convex optimization functions, which means they can converge quite quickly, and they're very well formed. So you're able to find minimums quite well. They're highly optimized off-the-shelf solvers that exist, such as conjugate gradient, which are really, really, really fast. So it's hard to really, so making your own is not necessary. And they allow for more complex constraints through non-analytical partial legalizers, since I don't need to encode them into an objective function. And there's a clear separation of objectives from constraints because I encode my objectives into the quadratic term, and then I encode my constraints into anchor points, for example. And finally, it's easily generalizable. You can pick and put little passes in between the partial legalization step to account for different architecture differences you might have in your different FPGAs. One of the major downsides is that partial legalizers tend to be very slow, so they need to be simplified. I can't just use any old partial legalizer. I have to try and make it as efficient as I can. And also the objective and constraints fight in ways that are hard to predict. You're encoding it into your quadratic function, so it's hard to really trade off different constraints and different objectives. Next, the nonlinear global placers, a big positive is that it combines the objective and constraints into a single objective equation, which can be solved faster with a highly optimized optimizer. It also is easier to trade off constraints versus objectives through weight terms because you control the equation, and it's fully analytical, which is as opposed to the global placer, which tends to be a little less analytical. One of the more downsides is that it's harder to generalize. You kind of have to create architecture-specific constraint functions. Most of them aren't architecture-specific, but if you want to get really high-quality results, you kind of have to go deep into the architecture and create objective functions for that. You also need differentiable objectives and constraints, which can be somewhat limiting, especially because you need them to be efficient. It doesn't matter if you have a really amazing objective, a really amazing constraint, if it takes n squared every iteration to compute this. That's just not acceptable. So you need something that's not only differentiable, but that you can solve efficiently. And then finally, it's hard to create a highly optimized solver. It's hard to find off-the-shelf solvers for your specific objective and constraint. You got to do the derivative yourself, which can be quite expensive and challenging to do.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. So you explicitly calculate the derivative.
Yes.
And because your formulation is different, you got to write the code to do that.
Yes.
So it's related to stochastic gradient descent, where in machine learning you also explicitly calculate derivative, but you can use all these packages that do it for you.
Correct. I don't know why people don't do that, but even RePlAce didn't compute the derivative using an off-the-shelf Python derivative calculator. I'm guessing it was already too slow.
They hand calculated all themselves.
Yes, well, they made I'll get into this, but they made a special kernel that actually computes the derivative. Like you say compute derivative and you call that kernel. My guess is just that was too slow. And so, yeah. Any other questions? Because I'm going to move on from this into our first global placer.
I mean, I guess the convex, a quadratic is differentiable.
Yeah.
Right. So if you want to go through a convex optimizer, it also is differentiable.
Correct. But you get your derivative. I don't want to say you get your derivative for free, but computing computing this equation as a system of linear equations is actually it's off the shelf, and people actually already have solvers specifically for this. So you already have a very optimized solver. Here, if you could create a really optimized solver for your nonlinear global placer, that's great. But then if you change any of your objectives, you change any of your constraints, you have to retune everything, which can be quite expensive. So those are the pros and cons of the different global placers. So now I'm going to get into the papers that I'm going to be discussing today. So this is our family tree of the papers.
Peace.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Never mind. So these are the papers I'm going to be talking about today. And this is like a family tree where papers influence other papers. ePlace MS wasn't the first paper to do electrostatic global placement, but this was a continuation of their work. And I found this to be this particular paper to be more encompassing of the full problem, because they increased the ePlace problem by dealing with mixed sized things like macros and atoms in ASICs. RePlAce, and so this is an ASIC electrostatic placer. RePlAce built on the ePlace algorithm by further tuning it and improving it with a better constraint, and that's how they were able to get better results. DreamPlace casts this problem as a neural network optimization, and they actually allow to use GPU acceleration for both RePlace and ePlace. The gray ones are the ASIC placers. ELFplace was the first FPGA placer to use the ePlace algorithm onto FPGAs. DreamPlace FPGA is a marry between ELFplace and DreamPlace. And then finally, ELFplace FCCM 2024 was a GPU accelerated ELFplace, but they also added timing terms, which I hopefully will talk about next week.
Who did RePlAce? Is that David Pan's group, or is that the UCS group?
See that? I do not remember.
That's fine.
Yeah, but I don't remember. I'm sorry. So the first paper we're going to be talking about is ePlace, and this is where I'm going to be going really in depth into a bit of the mathematics, because it's important to understand the rest of the flow by delving deep into this. So first of all, it's good to look at the objective function. So the objective function for most ASIC analytical placers, if not all of them, is to minimize half-perimeter wire length. And half-perimeter wire length can be written in this closed form as the sum of the maximum of the differences between all the positions in the connections in both the X and Y location. But there's a big problem here. That's not differentiable. So I can't use this in a nonlinear solver. So we need to turn this into a differentiable form by relaxing it. We do this using two different approximations. ePlace implemented both of them and let you choose it in the command line. You can either do the log sum exponent or the weighted average. These are the equations, and they look a bit scary, but all you need to think about is that as this gamma parameter gets larger and larger and larger, this will become a more accurate representation of the half-perimeter wire length, but the equation gets less smooth. And we want very smooth differentiable functions because it allows us to do gradient descent more efficiently. So oftentimes what algorithms will do is they set gamma to be some value, and they increase it over the course of several iterations to make it more and more accurate. And sorry, I say as gamma gets larger, as gamma goes towards 1. Or I guess, I think it goes smaller. Yeah, I think it goes smaller, it becomes sharper. I think you're right.
Yeah, this is a sharpening function. So you take your xi, you divide by, say, a small number.
Yeah.
You get the exponential of something big. You add them all up, you're dominated by whoever's the biggest.
Yep.
You take the logarithm to get rid of your exponential, and for gamma approaching 0, this basically approaches a max function. But
Right.
as you said, I guess if you actually set it all the way to 0, it's basically very sharp and probably pretty hard to differentiate.
And also numerically unstable. You set that equal to 0.00001, that exponential gets very, very large.
Yeah, like I can analytically differentiate it still, but my derivative is almost a delta function.
Exactly.
So it's basically becoming numerically poorly controlled.
Correct.
Let's do the weighted average. The weighted average is you take the exponential of everything. It's the same trick. You're sharpening everything.
Yep.
You're weighting it, instead of doing a log, you're weighting everybody by an exponential. And then you just divide by the exponential sum.
Right.
Okay. That's kind of almost like a softmax calculation. It's the same idea.
I think it's really similar.
Softmax is also like a sharpening function. So
Right. And I bolded weighted average because future papers focus on the weighted average model, and they almost all use it. Not many people are using the log sum exponent. It's not that it doesn't exist. It's just I see most papers are using the weighted average model. So that's our objective function. And if I only had the,
Sorry to slow you down a little.
oh, yeah, no worries.
So you're saying you break the two dimensions independently.
Yeah.
And then you add up, so you get for a given net, you get the wire length of both dimensions independently, and then you sum them all up over all the edges of it.
Yep. I just want to have completeness because I use these special terms down here. Thank you. So if I only focus on my wire length objective, everything's going to rush to the center of the device. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, technically it's like same as in you technically separate the solving for X and solving for Y.
Yes. And it's important for the solving step. For thinking about the objective, it's not that necessary to split them, but if you are going to solve this using differentiation, the gradient of the X and the Y dimensions are separable. It just makes it a little bit more efficient to solve. So if I were to only care about my HPWL objective, everything's going to snap to the center, which is not very efficient. Without constraints, all the cells will pile on top of each other. What we need is a constraint function which models the density and applies a penalty to those dense regions. And this is how all analytical solvers for ASIC placers work. And they differentiate each other by how they model density. And in this paper, what we do is we model the density using electrostatics. So this will look like this equation. It's the same equation that you've seen that we saw before. So this is where the electrostatics will come in. So the idea is we model every object, including something called fillers, which I'll get into, as a positive charge. What that means is that all the atoms feel a repulsive force from each other, and they feel this electric field that gets produced from the very dense regions off to the very undense regions. And the density function N of V, which is our constraint objective, would then be modeled as the total electric potential of energy of the system, which is this equation. Now, it looks a little scary, but Q sub I is just the electric quantity charge of cell I, which is approximately proportional to the area of the object. And phi of I, or psi of I, is the local potential. Basically, what is it feeling at this point in its current position? And N of V is just the sum of all of these total electric potential energies. And we can solve this equation through correlating the density to psi using Poisson's equations on the right. These are a little bit confusing, but basically they're a way of translating your density, where are the atoms located physically with this electric potential energy. This is a boundary condition, which says that the gradient on the boundary of the device is 0. And this one's just making sure the total potential energy is a constant. And we can solve this efficiently using a 2D FFT applied to the spatial domain. This is actually the most important part of this paper, because as I mentioned before, it doesn't matter if you have the world's greatest way of modeling density. You need to be able to compute it efficiently. And you may think every charge needs to know the charge of everyone around it. The FFT algorithm they use here is actually n log n. So they were able to get a very efficient way of computing the derivative of the electric potential fields. It's quite remarkable, and they're able to compute this very efficiently. Yeah, no, I also did the same thing. It's confusing, but it works.
No, I'm thinking of why it's n hat dot gradient.
Oh, n hat dot gradient.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the n hat is something else. It's the normal direction to the boundary.
Yeah, I understand. The normal boundary condition for a Poisson equation, though, an electrostatic equation would be that it would be the direction, the parallel to the boundary has to be 0.
I actually have a good picture for this. I think what they're trying to do is to make it so that things can still go right along the boundary without having to like completely stop dead in their tracks on the corners, on the edges, I mean.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the electrostatic analogy. So in electrostatics, if that was actually a conductor, like an electric conductor, the boundary condition is the opposite of that. That's the perfect magnetic conductor boundary condition.
Interesting.
Okay.
They gave it a funny name. It was like Newton's or Neumann's boundary condition or something like that. So I think this is just a standard technique they were following.
That is one of the boundary conditions. That probably is Neumann's is another name, standard name for boundary condition. Okay, anyway, it's just an more unusual condition for electrostatics.
No, that makes sense. And so what happens is all of these electric charges create an electric field and they drew the electric field lines onto this graph. And what you can see here is that all of these atoms are feeling a force that's pushing them away from this highly dense region. And what's keeping them together is their attraction through the HPWL objective. And as I increase my lambda, I'm going to be increasing the strength of my electric field, or I'm really increasing the force that atoms feel in the field, and that forces them away from what they want, which is the HPWL objective, which is what you see here. So fillers, atoms, and macros produce this electric field. But now what are these fillers that I'm talking about? So why do I need to use something called fillers? Well, the idea is that if I had all of these atoms and this is, yeah, if I had all of these atoms and at the very beginning, they're all right on top of each other and they have this huge spike. And this dashed line is basically the capacity of this region. Well, how many atoms can this region hold? And the thing is that once I start to spread based on the electrostatic forces, they're going to be spread out very far. And what happens is it's not going to stop until we don't have any more overlap anymore. But when that happens, we have these regions over on the far right and left, which are way more underfilled than they need to be. And we have the regions in the center, which may be more overfilled than what you'd like. What you'd like is for things to be spread out just enough so that all of them are at their max density. So what that causes too much spreading. So what we would like is to insert these things called fillers. These fillers have no connections with anything. They don't connect through HPWL objectives. What they do connect to is that they are electrostatically charged. So all of these are charged, and what happens is because they're not attracted to these red terms, but repulsed, they will actually spread out. And this is what actually fills in the gaps, so you get a nice constant density. This is actually, what this does is it keeps atoms from spreading more than they need to. I did verify this in the papers. This is what they talk about.
Do they have any constraints on the fillers, or they just put them in and say, go wherever you want?
Go wherever you want, but they have an electric charge.
Okay.
Yeah, and also and they obey the laws of all the other atoms, which means they can't go off the boundaries and stuff like that.
And you said they're able to solve Poisson's equation with a 2D FFT?
Yes.
Hmm.
Well, they're able to get the derivative, which is what they need. It's very interesting. So this is what's interesting. They make, I'll talk about this later. They make some assumptions that they say have no effect on the overall solution, but it makes it easier to solve. And that's how they're able, so in order to get the gradient of this equation, you end up getting the gradient of phi I, which is basically charge times force, which they use eta, if you read the paper.
Field.
Yes.
So you can sum it up by basically doing, like, say, like just taking the integral of adding all of the
Right.
Charges up. So you can do it with an integral formulation, because you know the Green's function for the electric field, right? Is Coulomb's law.
Mhm.
I'm trying to figure out why that turns into a 2D FFT. Okay.
The paper goes into a lot of detail on this. I save it from the slides because it's a little over the top, but just know they were able to do this efficiently using an FFT. So another thing that they talk about in this paper, which is very important, is something that I thought when I immediately saw this problem. This is a problem that I saw. If everything's repulsed from each other, they're just going to go off to the boundaries. The reason why is because all these charges feel a force from all other charges in the system. And the thing is that this charge right here feels an awful repulsion from here, and it sees a nice empty region off in infinity. So as I increase lambda more and more, everything's going to go spewing off into the boundaries, which is something that they noted. And they were able to fix this problem by doing what they call DC removal. When they did the FFT, they just removed the DC component. And what they argue happens is that this raises the level of the DC component up to the average density, which ends up being so that these dead regions become negatively charged and these higher regions become positively charged, and it causes things to spread in a way that will equalize the charge. It's a really interesting thing, and I really like this figure from the paper, so I wanted to talk about it here. It's just a little technique that they did to further improve the spreading, but that's why this isn't exactly an electrostatic system. They've done some things to the problem to make it spread in a way that they like a little better. So DC terms removed from the frequency domain, which gives them this effect. So how do we solve this nonlinear equation? What we do is we have this minimization equation, and I need to solve using gradient descent. So to optimize this function, we use specifically, I don't know why that was highlighted. They use Nesterov's method with a preconditioned gradient step length backtracking with Lipschitz constant prediction. You can ignore that last part. The important part is Nesterov's methods. The other parts of this sentence are optimizations they've done on top of Nesterov's method to make it converge better for their problem. So with a preconditioned gradient, what that means is that they have taken their gradient and multiplied it by the inverse of the Hessian. That just makes it better conditioned, and they found that makes them handle mixed-size objects better. But all that means is just they've changed their derivative and scaled it by something on the order of the second order derivative of the function. Next up, the step length backtracking with Lipschitz constant prediction. What that really is just saying, I'm going to estimate how far I should step along the gradient based on some math, as well as some numerical techniques where I do basically a line search. It's not exactly line search, but it's a similar idea. I'll walk that equation more. And so see the paper for how they compute the gradient in the Hessian, but they use a 2D FFT to obtain the electrostatic forces each iteration. And they make small approximations throughout, which they claim have little effect, but make the gradient in Hessian significantly cheaper to compute. And that's really important. Remember, we're not just trying to be accurate. We really want to be efficient here. So this is clear. I'm going to step through the algorithm for Nesterov's method, but this is how we optimize this equation. So Nesterov's method is printed in the paper, and it's right here. And what we see is one of the inputs is the preconditioned gradient, which again is just, they call it Jacobi preconditioner. It's a estimate of the Hessian, which is just the diagonal elements of the Hessian, inversed multiplied by the gradient. Basically take each term of the gradient and divide by the second order derivative. That makes it better conditioned. And then I'm going to step through this line by line. The first line says, how big of a step should I take along the gradient? That's what the alpha term is. The second step is take that step. This is the gradient descent. And that's our output. U of k plus 1 is the output to this function. But what we do next is to prepare us for the next iteration. We do a little bit more math. We have to approximate the optimization step length for the next iteration, and then we kind of compute the next v for that step length prediction, which is kind of related to the backtracking function. So don't look too deeply into the sentence in a second. But what we're really doing right here is just getting a length, taking a step along the gradient. So now, what is that backtracking function?
Can I ask a more basic question?
Sure.
Okay, so V is is actually your locations, is that correct?
The current locations, that's
So
correct.
V of k is your current location, V of k plus 1 is your next location.
Kind of. It's weird. They do this kind of like hopping where they go v of k is your current iteration, u of k plus 1 is the next one.
Oh, okay.
It's
because I was going to ask, like, what is U then?
To be honest, it's really confusing in the paper, and I wasn't quite certain myself. They say very specifically that u of k plus 1 is the outputted answer, the final answer at the end. I don't know if that means it's u of k plus 1 is always uses the output every iteration, but I don't think it really matters as long as you keep track of it.
Like line 2 is basically move along the gradient.
Yes.
Take my current location and move, I guess in the opposite direction of the gradient.
Correct.
So gradient says, what do they go with that? Okay, so gradient is like up, cost function is going higher. If I go that way, go the other way.
Yep.
So that makes sense. That's gradient descent on line 2.
And
Line
then
1 and line 3 are basically trying to figure out an intelligent step size. How far do I move along that?
correct.
And then VK plus 1 is,
Take the next iteration, the final answer, plus some scaled offset of that. Like it's almost like we
oh, it's like a momentum term.
Correct.
Okay, so
It's-
that's a momentum term. Okay. So they've got.
I think
U and
so,
K to-
actually.
What's that?
It's like to add in.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and we see this also in the backtracking method. This is again just is a little bit like just trust that this is Nesterov's method, where they have made changes beyond just the precondition, which is just changing the input of the gradient. They also do this Lipschitz constant prediction with step length backtracking, which is actually really simple. This is Lipschitz constant, or at least the inverse of it, which is just the difference in your gradient between this the current position and the previous one, divided by the magnitude of the difference. And that's your Lipschitz constant, which they found to be a very good step length, or the inverse of it to be a good step length. And then the backtracking prevents step length overestimation. So they actually try the step length and see if they're going up or down, and they use that to help guide themselves. Now, there's a bit ambiguity in this sentence right here because although they use a while loop here, I think they actually use an if statement. And what happens is if it doesn't resolve to true, they actually skip and they try again. But I think that might just be an optimization they tried in one of the results section.
My guess is that a lot of this is detail though, that is just trying to make their solver like more efficient.
Correct.
The basic thing is gradient descent, and then there's a well-known thing of how far do I move along the gradient. And it's known that adding in a momentum term can often make things faster, so that's what they're doing in line 4.
Yep.
They're basically saying if I have been moving in this direction for a while, add some more movement in that direction and to try to go faster.
Yep.
And then the whole rest of the thing, I think, is like a whole, like, see if my step length is good or not.
Exactly. They have a whole argument in their paper about whether to use line search or not, which is a more common technique to use in this case, but they don't use line search, they call this backtracking.
But my guess is, like, my honest guess is this is kind of a detail.
Yes.
Like, if I basically went in and simplified a bunch of this, maybe my solver would be 2 or 3 times slower, I'm not sure.
Right.
If I did a really bad job, maybe my solver wouldn't converge. Change my step length to be smaller, so.
Well, that makes sense.
um,
So this is their solver though. It's as you can see, it has nothing to do with their problem. This is actually a pretty general form of Nesterov's method and backtracking. They've just added a little bit of extra spice to make it work better for their application. And finally, this is the overall flow. What we have here is they start with a quadratic initial placement. They compute the gradient, compute the Hessian to precondition the gradient.
Let me ask you, so quadratic initial placement, you say actually take the convex wire length formulation and they solve that? That's their
I
initial
believe so.
placement?
They just called it a quadratic initial placement. So I believe they're using like bound to bound.
With no spreading or anything, they just kind of solve it,
I think so.
and so,
With fixed points, yes.
like, well, with fixed IOs or something? Like,
Something's fixed. This
so
is
they
a
probably-
ASIC, so.
Probably they just, so it sounds like they probably solve it once, I mean, that's maybe what A is that correct? Like, they start out with a lot of overlap then?
Yes, I believe so. A is actually a few iterations later, but yes.
Okay,
And so we have a quadratic initial placement. We just need an n initial solution for the gradient to start. And we start with gradient computation. We do a Hessian preconditioning to that gradient, Lipschitz prediction, which I just showed you, and then they do step length backtracking. And then this else statement, I believe, is what I was talking about that while loop before, but let's just ignore it. We do the Nesterov optimization. Is our density overflow greater than 10%? If not, continue. Eventually you'll stop. You say, I'm done. They do macro legalization. Those are those big black rectangles. They want to lock those down into good positions. And then they continue the gradient descent again, this time with the macros locked down. This is actually a pretty common technique. These big blocks are going to have huge effects on your solution. Use global placement to find good positions for them, lock them down, and then continue solving later. This is actually a technique that you'll see later in ePlace. But yeah, and also there's some pretty pictures. The blue is the fillers, the red are the atoms, the blacks are the macros. And what we can see is the fillers get shot away because they're repulsed by all these atoms, but the atoms are pulling everyone together. And eventually, as things spread out, we start to have a more equilibrium for the electric potential, which causes everything to spread. And this is also showing why the fillers are so important. They fill in the space that no one else wants to take to keep these red ones together. Does that make sense? It seems more like fluid. I know, I agree, but it's modeled using electrostatics. So I also thought the same thing. So this is a summary of ePlace. It's objective, minimize half perimeter wire length. They use two terms, but weighted average approximation seems to be the more common one nowadays. Their constraint, we use an electrostatic density function, where we use an FFT to compute the gradient, and this is very efficient. They claim it's n log n, and I believe them because the runtime isn't explosive. Their optimizer is Nesterov's method with a preconditioned gradient and step length backtracking with Lipschitz constant prediction. And again, the preconditioner just helps with mixed size objects, and the Lipschitz constant helps to take good steps with backtracking, preventing overstepping. And they also and the key idea of this paper, which I think is what makes it so seminal and important, is that they make approximations in their objective, constraint, and optimizers to update the positions faster. And they use an FFT to compute, and they use an FFT which is computed using an off-the-shelf solver, so it's extremely efficient. Faster updates lead to more iterations, which can lead to higher quality results within your time budget. And this is a common theme for any good analytical placer. You could have, again, the best representation for your constraints and objectives. If you can't compute it efficiently, it's useless. You need to be able to compute that derivative efficiently. So that was the ePlace paper. It's quite beautiful, actually. I really like how they represent it and how they argue for how to make it run efficiently. Are there any questions on how ePlace is computed?
I have to go read it, the FFT is the most magical part of this.
Yeah, I know.
Usually you can't, I I mean, maybe they approximate things with periodic functions in order to like do this more efficiently, because they don't need a perfect solution. Usually I can't actually go solve Poisson's equation just by doing an FFT on an arbitrary distribution of sources.
Right.
What they have.
They use an approximation. They actually prove that they actually go through the FFT and show what the results will be. Then they say, this is pretty much just this. And then they change it to that. And they say, that's how we solve it efficiently. So those are the approximations that I'm talking about. They give 3 pages on how they use the FFT for this. I left it out of the slide deck because I think the important part is we model this as electrostatics, and you can trust that you can compute the gradient using what they show. Which is kind of a great technique if you want to use analytical placers, because sometimes you just kind of trust that they say that it's going to work as they expect. So we've talked about ePlace. We're going to now talk about RePlace. How are we doing on time? Well, this is taking a lot longer than I expected. You were right, Vaughn.
Oh, that was good. I think if you try to go, this is, how many people, okay, let's give Alex feedback. How many people think it's going too slow? Don't be shy, you know, you won't hurt his feelings. How many people think it's going just right? It's around right, like, so, okay, how many people think it's going to?
Come on, Sale.
So yeah, so like trying to do this an hour, like this would be madness, right? So.
Well, I'm glad I didn't finish this
But
slide
actually,
deck, so.
that's useful feedback. So some people think around, right? But we're asking you questions. I'm doing that somewhat to slow you down too. And if anything, people are like, there's nobody thinking.
No, that makes sense. So ePlace was a great paper. They got really great results for HPWL and runtime. RePlace came along and updates the constraint function in order to get better quality solutions, but at the consequence of having a worse runtime, which I'll show why that happens.
Okay, I'm gonna show you a couple comments too on like ePlace. So you got, I mean, this, you can tell me if you agree or not, because you read the paper more carefully. We haven't actually read the original ePlace. I don't think there's anything magic about electrostatics, right? Like, you're kind of going like, why is electrostatics magic? It's a repulsive force. And it's one where there's been a lot of math done to like, if you have like a 1/r² force, then when you actually go, you can solve for a source distribution, what would the potential be? And it's just a solution of that Poisson equation, right? Grad squared psi equals the charge density. So you know it from electrostatics. So I don't think there's anything magic about it, but they want like a repulsive force. They decide 1/r² seems reasonable, so it drops off relatively fast, and then they get to leverage a whole bunch of math, right? Of like, which they could have made up some other function, but then they wouldn't have been able to leverage that math.
Yep.
So that's what I think they're doing.
And-
Rather than like, and that's also why approximations are probably very reasonable, because it was like, look, we're sort of inspired by this, but in the end, we're not really solving a field equation, so we have to just kind of change it a bit to make it faster. Who cares?
And Vaughn's right. That's the key to all great analytical placers. It's not about the analogy. It's about computing some repulsive force efficiently. Because again, I can't have everything repulsed from every other atom, because if I check every atom, check all of it, every single other atom and feel the forces of that can be a very expensive computation.
It's just spreading.
That's the spreading part.
Yeah, there's lots of spreading functions people have used that it's just like density overlap. Like they'll take like what's the local density and they'll kind of smooth it out, and then they'll basically have repulsive forces based on like how much over density there is. So it's the difference in ePlace is it has more of an action in distance, and they probably were inspired by the fact that charge does redistribute itself pretty evenly given some set of conductors.
They actually forced it to distribute evenly, actually. That's why they do the DC offset, and that's also why they add the fillers. It's so that it will distribute evenly.
Well, there's boundary conditions and so on as well. I mean,
yeah, I
charge actually will try to go on the surface. They don't want that to go on the outside surface. So they got a bunch of things here that, I mean, they're effectively moving their their measurement of potential. We usually decide that potential at infinity is like 0 because it's convenient, but you don't have to.
Yep, then they change it to, they call it phi/2, which is the average density of all the tiles. But yeah, Vaughn's right. And it also is a really simple computation. Again, you just ignore the lowest level frequency. So yeah, that is ePlace. So now I'm going to be talking about RePlace, and the name will make sense in a second. So RePlace is a global placement based off of ePlace with 3 differences. It adds a local density term to the constraint for cells overlapping bins. So now we're going to have an extra term that says if you're overlapping a bin, feel an extra force. It also adds a local density memory force to the optimizer. So atoms that were in very dense bins before will still feel a pretty strong force in the future. And finally, they update the global density scaling based on information from a trial placement run. So I'm going to go through each of these steps in detail. So first of all, this is the optimization function. And this is going to look very familiar. This is your weighted average HPWL objective from ePlace. This is your density function from ePlace, which they gave the title of global, which all atoms will feel from all other atoms. We have our RePlAce, which is the global density penalty factor. And we have this new local density function. Now, they didn't modify anything in gray hasn't been modified. It's the new local density function that they've added. So the problem that RePlAce says about ePlace is that all atoms are going to feel the same global lambda force from the electrostatics. So this I5 felt a pretty strong force to get out of the way of that macro. But that caused all of these other ones, which aren't in a very dense region, to scatter very strongly away. When in reality, it's only this bin that's really overfilled. The other ones aren't as overfilled. So what they argue for, and this creates a larger half perimeter wire length, which they argue for. What they say is, what if each bin provides independent force to each of the atoms? So this one's very overfilled, so it's going to feel a very strong force. And this one is really not overfilled, so it's going to feel a very weak force. And they argue that by having small mu's, which is the symbol right here, for each bin, which is going to push things away, you can have a smaller HPWL. And that's the key idea here. Overfilled bins force atoms strongly.
Let me just think, let me stop, let me absorb this a little.
The map makes it easier to understand, actually.
Let's see, okay, so they're keeping the original electrostatic between every primitive.
Correct.
Right, or everything, every object feels like a force based on electrostatics. Then they're adding this new concept of bins, and then a bin exerts a force on, so there's a force between every bin and every object.
No, it's every bin and all the atoms that it contains.
Okay, so only on the ones that are in it.
Yes.
Okay, so if that bin is the more overfilled the bin is, the stronger that force is.
Yes.
And that force is in what direction and what magnitude?
The same direction and magnitude they were on their way to go. So this kind of adds, I'll show you the math. They take the same charge times electric field and they multiply it by a scalar, which is determined by the overfill of the bin.
Is it, do they assume like the charge is at the center of the bin to the thing that's moving?
No.
Or they basically are just scaling the existing one?
Anything in this bin is multiplied by nu4. Anything in this bin is multiplied by nu1. Anything in this bin is multiplied by nu2.
So they're just multiplying by it?
Yes.
Like they're taking the current electrostatic forces and just scaling them?
There is a little bit of spice they add in there, which they take the overlapping area and multiply it. So if something is more in the bin, but if you have very small atoms, you're not going to notice that.
Okay, maybe I'll let you go into the math.
Yeah, the math makes it a lot easier. So recall from ePlace, our global density function looks like this, which is just charge times potential energy. With RePlAce, overfilled bins apply a force to the cells inside. I'm actually going to get up and point to this because it's a little bit easier to talk about. So Aij is is the overlap between the current cell and the bin that it contains, or that contains it. Qi phi j is your charge time potential energy again.
I'm gonna stop it for a second. Okay, so let's go back to D global. Just make sure this is a test of comprehension. So let's see if I can comprehend it. So that would actually be interpreted as the area of cell I times the potential energy, which is a function of all of the other cells and basically the Green's function.
This isn't exact area, but it's proportional to, yes, I agree.
Okay, so that's what I get for that. Okay, so then I go to the D local and you have.
B is bins,
Okay.
and C is the cells in the bins.
Okay, so for the bins, for all the bins, take all the cells in the bin and.
Add up all of their potential energy.
Okay,
multiply
that's
by
the
the area.
overlap, so that's like their force, and then Qi, we're using Qi again.
Yeah, no, so it's a double area here, which I do agree is kind of strange.
Okay, so they're scaling it by the whole area, then the area again, then the, let's see, Pj, phi j, that's just.
The phi in J, which I think, actually, yeah, that actually might be the
That's
phi
the
of J.
bin.
That's the bin, yeah.
Okay,
They didn't make that clear in the paper, I think, or I must have missed it. Yeah, that's just the potential energy, the total potential energy in the bin. And then mu J, that's given by this equation. The more overfilled you are, you'll exponentially get worse. The less overfilled you are, it gets way smaller.
Hmm.
So this is the key thing they've added, or one of the three key things they've added. Let people absorb that for a second. Basically, what this means is that overfilled bins apply force to the cells inside. That's what this means. And so instead of just every cell just feeling a repulsive force from all other cells around it, or all other cells, period, it also feels an extra force from the bins that are overfilled.
But where did, like, what's the direction for that?
The direction of the bin force, it doesn't, so that's going to take the derivative of this.
Yeah.
This is a constant, this is a constant, this is the only thing that's changing, which is your electric field
Yeah, so like the way
Field
it's,
for the
for the
bin.
for the
yeah, because
bin.
that's the voltage, so the derivative is the electric field. The way it's written, it sounds like that's measured at the center of the bin.
Yeah.
So we're
Yeah.
actually getting like.
But I should be
the
clear,
Center of the bin, like everything else is, I was thinking this like an integral formulation, like you can work out what the electric potential is somewhere by adding up the contributions from all the charges, right? Like the Q over R. So you would get a potential center of the bin, you could take its gradient and it would tell you what direction you're trying to go. And it looks like it's trying to force everybody of go along the gradient of where essentially at center of the bin, what is the direction of decreasing electric decreasing potential, so let's say electric field direction. So I guess a global idea of where is density getting better, everybody in the bin feels an extra
tug.
push along that.
Now, I should be clear, I ripped this from the paper, so that J could really be a lot of things, but it does seem like J is corresponding to the bin, so I think I agree with you, but I'm not certain.
I mean, the way they've written that is the bin, so
Yeah.
then it would presumably be at the center of the bin or something.
I agree. So, yep, that's the local density function. And so there's a problem though if I do this. And they show this problem over in this case. When you're in an overfilled bin, you're going to feel a really strong repulsive force. When you get out of that bin, though, you're immediately not going to feel that repulsive force anymore. And what happens is that the cells quickly lose their force when they leave overfilled bin, which isn't a very desirable trait. But what's worse is because I'm removing a force, let's take a look at I3 here. I3 leaves the cell, but maybe it starts to feel a strong attraction to I2, I6, and I10 again. It doesn't have the strong repulsive force anymore, so it's going to cause it to go back. And this will cause it to oscillate. These oscillations are what we want to avoid. So we need some form of momentum or memory that says, I was in a bin that was overfilled in the past. I want to feel a continued repulsion force away from that bin. And that's where they have this extra term, which I call the local density memory force.
Actually, this picture also implies that what I just said doesn't make sense, because they're not all seeing a force in the same direction.
Correct.
So if this is the actual local density force, it can't be computed in the middle of the bin.
I should be clear, not
So-
quite. So remember, they're still adding the global force. So
But yeah, so if it was almost all global, then I guess it could be, but
Yeah.
it's kind of would be a confusing figure.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. So yeah, so the idea is let's give cells memory of their history of being in overfilled bins. Now I should be clear, I added the word memory here. They don't call it this. They give it a really confusing name, but I call it memory because what we're doing here is we take this term delta I iter, and that's going to be our force. And what we do is I think it's initialized to 0. And what we do is we just add on to it some scalar multiple of the overflow of the current bin it's in. And then we just keep adding to it over and over and over again for each cell I or each instance I. Then what we do, we apply the force directly to the position update, which they call cost, which means we actually take the derivative and then multiply the derivative by delta I. This is different than multiplying the d local and then taking the derivative. It's almost like we took delta I times x of I inside the d local. I find this the strangest part of the whole paper because there's no we've lost physical meaning because this would imply that this is a multiple of the position times this scalar term inside the original density equation, which is very strange, but this is what they claim to do. And so, yeah, and this is what they show in their figure. They say with no local density force, I feel these strong repulsion, and then I get these weaker ones. They continue on their merry way to continue along, to feel the same forces.
There's a lot of tuning that went into this thing.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, just wait till you see the last part. This is one of my favorite papers just because of how creative they got. So this is the very creative thing that they decided to do. So this plot you see on the left is the HPWL over several iterations. HPWL starts out very low because everything we're optimizing for HPWL, and then we spread things out, HPWL is going to get worse. And what they noticed is we have these interesting inflection points, which they call TP2, which they label by stars, where the HPWL changes quite dramatically, where we have a really strong change, and then we have these nice inflection points. And these squares, which they call TP1s, are flat regions where we continue on a trend. And what we say is many decisions are being made at TP2, and not many decisions are being made at TP1. We're just continuing along a straight line path. Again, this is what they say in the paper. And the idea is let's use smaller step sizes in my gradient descent on TP2 and use larger step sizes at TP1 to make it converge faster. But now a question.
Wait a second, what is TP1 again?
TP1 are these squares, the flat regions.
Okay.
And the question is, how do you know where TP2 and 1 are? It's almost like you need to compute global placement in order to get them. Well, that's exactly what they do. They run global placement twice. The first time they call this a trial run, where they actually get the curve, find the points of inflection and these flat regions, which they call TP2 and TP1, and use that to guide their Nesterov method. So they call it a trial placement. They take their initial placement, they pass it through the trial placement. They do all these things to get the transition points. And you may say, that sounds like a great idea. What's the downside? Well, it's obvious. About a fifth to a sixth of the runtime is used to compute this. Now, of course, they're gaining extra information, which is probably saving them a lot of time in global placement. But computing an entire global placement beforehand was a very odd choice for me. And it's not something that you see repeated in ePlace or other.
So let me see if I understand this. They're essentially doing a trial placement to get essentially a schedule for all their terms, like their various. Is that correct?
A schedule for how they choose the step size. So
Yeah,
they want
like they have all these step sizes and they have sort of momentum terms and so on. So they're doing a trial placement to essentially pre-tune that?
Yes.
Okay.
Which is very interesting. I mean, it makes sense because their goal here is to improve their HPWL results or their final results. And in their results, they actually are better than basically all others, but they are quite a bit slower. Sometimes they're a bit faster, but for the most part, I've seen them to be about 2 times slower for some benchmark sets and 5 times slower for some other benchmark sets. So they are quite different. So the objective is a weighted average HPWL approximation. Their constraints are ePlace electrostatic density function with local density. Overfill bins increase the spreading force of cells they contain and accumulate local density memory force. They call it local density force, but I added the word memory to further spread cells from dense bins. And the optimizer is literally exactly the same. It's Nesterov's method plus some fancy stuff with dynamic step size adaptation, where they update the step size based on a trial global placement, and they achieve better QOR, but at the cost of increased runtime. So more work to compute the new density function per bin, more work to compute the memory force, and the dynamic step size adaptation requires an entire trial global placement run. I want to be clear, these first 2 bullet points are not to be forgotten. These are actually quite expensive. You have to go through every single bin and go through all the atoms in that bin to compute these new terms. That's expensive. And that, of course, it's not n squared, but it's an expensive thing to compute, and that can really hurt your runtime, which is something you always want to be mindful of in an analytical placement. I honestly think that these 2 bullet points probably had a worse effect on runtime than the 3rd bullet point. That's just my opinion, though. I can't really verify that. So that is the RePlAce algorithm. I know we should pause here.
I'm gonna have to take my laptop, so I have to go.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good place to stop as well. So we're going to talk about DreamPlace next and the FPGA placers. A lot easier to understand now that we know ePlace.
And you can think about ePlace and come back with questions next week, right?
Absolutely. Once you guys have done your homework. Anyways, we're going to stop it right here. We'll start again next week. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining me.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So.
I'll stop the share, or let me kill the recording.